Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the age of genius, right? This unit that we're now talking about right now, that kind of like back end of absolutism stuff, and then the scientific revolution, and then the Enlightenment, is oftentimes, Pierre, referred to as the age of genius, right? So it's oftentimes referred to as the age of genius due to the massive amount of scientific reforms and Enlightenment reforms and all these different big ideas that are going to be coming out of this entire moment, right? Also, do y'all like Pierre's pajamas? He absolutely loves them. There is like cowboy pajamas because it's like a cow and he's a boy. All right, so isn't that a genius remark right there? All right, so now the big thing about it, though, is in general, we are talking about that age of genius, right? We're talking about the scientific revolution in class. We did all of our astronomers and all of our posters and stuff like that. We talked about Rene Descartes, and y'all crushed that little activity. I'm really, really impressed. Make sure real quick, though, also that you jump back and you bang out that warm-up a little bit, just so you can kind of get used to these people and their ideas, right? You need to be able to delineate the difference between Copernicus and Galileo and Brahe and Kepler and Descartes and then Newton when we talk about him in class, and then Vesalius when we talk about him, and then all these other different figures that we've really began to get into. Now, the thing that we need to understand, though, is we're now going to be moving into the Enlightenment, right? So we're going to do this really quick, so you're going to leave some space in your notes, okay, for 4 more people, okay? So take about however much space you had in your notes, okay, that you did for those first 6 people, and then you're going to have about room for about 4 more people, okay? And the 4 more people are not going to be, like, super intense, but then skip down and start a new section on the Enlightenment, okay? Now, the Enlightenment is going to be very important because it is going to be just another extension of the Renaissance, of humanist thought, and also a progression, but it's going to begin to affect politics and society, okay? Now, going into it, what we need to understand, and this right here, you can actually copy down if you so choose, right, if you want to, or you can screenshot it or something if you want to. A screenshot might actually be a really great idea. The thing that we're now talking about, though, is how basically all these major events were all going on at a very similar amount of time, okay? So you got De Rev, of course, by Nicholas Copernicus coming out in 1543, advocating for actually the heliocentric orbit pattern. You got the 30 Years' War actually happening after Nicholas Copernicus already dies, right? And that's something that we've already talked about like a while back. Some of you are like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, we jumped backwards to the 1500s when we talked about Copernicus? Yeah, we did, y'all. I hate to break it to you, but we did jump backwards and talk about that stuff, right? Because remember, our timeline flows. It's all over the place. I really have a great idea for a really big project at the end of the year where we do like a huge timeline. We actually talk about the different things. We also do a bracket of historical figures and argue about who's the most important, right? The thing about it, though, is 50 or 30 Years' War happened from 1618 to 1648, and Galileo died under house arrest while the 30 Years' War was going on. Another big thing about it, though, as well, in 1642 to 1641 or 51, you got the English Civil War going on. Hobbes publishes the Leviathan. Louis is going to be crowned king in 1643. Louis XIV, right? The Principia de Mathematica by Isaac Newton comes out, though, also in 1687. All this stuff is in the scientific revolution, but as we can see, 30 Years' War, era of absolutism, and the scientific revolution are all going on at the exact same time, right? And that was why we like to talk about a little bit how the absolutists of Europe actually supported the scientific revolution. They really liked it because it gave them more power. Of course, it's going to lead to their economic growth. It's going to help them actually delineate themselves between the church as well and help grow their own personal power. But they were very heavy supporters of the scientific revolution. 2 examples of this that you could actually write down real quick. Actually, 3 examples of this you could write down real quick if you actually really, I think you should write these down, right? You've got like Louis the 14th is going to open the French Academy of Sciences, right? In England, in the 1600s, opened by the Stuart monarchs themselves, is going to be this thing called the Royal Society, where they actually were like, that is what Isaac Newton himself was actually the president of. And when he was actually the president, he wrote the Principia de Mathematica when he actually was talking about gravity and gravitational forces. And then last but not least, Peter the Great actually opens up the Russian Academy of Sciences, right? So as you can see, absolutists and large-scale governments during the 1600s love that scientific revolution. Now, getting into it, though, as well, you got the 2 treatises on government that comes out by John Locke, who talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. You got Peter the Great's Grand Embassy that goes on in 1697. You got Prussia crowning its very first king by a man named Wilhelm I, right? 1713. And then also you got Louis XIV dies in 1715. All happening during an era that you might consider the Enlightenment, right? Now, so as we can see really quick, something we need to gain from this timeline real fast is that the scientific revolution leads directly into the Enlightenment. These 2 things are actually paired together a little bit because the scientific revolution and its ideas of inquiry and skepticism skepticism and actually empirical study is actually going to lead directly to the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment is going to try and tackle questions that you can't prove with an experiment. What's the best type of government, right? What is the role of laws in society? How many rights do people have? What's the best type of economy? How do we learn anything, right? Like all that stuff can't be proven with a simple experiment. It's more heady, it's more philosophy, right? And that's where the Enlightenment actually takes its root and leaps forward later on. So really, really quickly, let's talk about the Enlightenment, right? What is it? The Enlightenment is actually an intellectual and cultural movement of the 17th and 18th century, okay? 17th and 18th century, of course, being the 16 and 1700s. And what it is, though, is going to be three central concepts that it'll all be about, right? It's going to be thinking about reason and rationalism, right? Trying to use logic to figure out these all-inspired questions about society. It's going to take the scientific revolutionary ideas of study of the human nature, and it's all going to be focused on one key thing. The last thing that you might want to just kind of underline, highlight, star it, make it look better, is the Enlightenment focuses around progress, right? These different philosophers and these different philosophers are all going to begin to show up, and they want to advocate for the ideas of progress. How can we make lives better? How can we make people better? How can we actually get the best government to protect the rights of the people? How can we make sure that people actually have the ability to avoid harsh taxation? How do we make sure that the government, though, has enough taxes to actually run a military and stuff like that? These things are all going to be questioned, and the Enlightenment thinkers are all the ones that try to actually answer all this stuff. Is it important for your religion to be out in the open, or should it be something that you do more at home and casually, right? So the thing about it, though, is the Enlightenment, like I said, is just all that stuff about the scientific revolution. But look, planets, Galileo, he's got a telescope, right? But the Enlightenment thinker has to try and reason his way through these with rationalism and with skeptical study, right? The Enlightenment, though, just so you know as well, is a very broad term that some historians argue, like the Renaissance, spanned over 100 years. But like, if you really wanted to make the argument, you're going to see the Enlightenment in its roots kind of pop down in about 1670, and you see the very first action of the Enlightenment kind of explode with the French Revolution that starts in 1789. So the Enlightenment is a very broad term, right? It's a lot like that Renaissance movement. This is kind of the idea that the Renaissance is just still going forward, right? That in the 1300s, after Dante writes the Divine Comedy and Petrarch begins his works, or like translating Titus Livy and stuff like that, that ball just started rolling. That snowball started going down this mountain and just started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the 1600s, you're going to see that snowball turn into the Enlightenment, right? It's going to pick up speed. It's going to start really, really carrying some things forward. And the biggest things that you need to also understand about the Enlightenment going into it is a big key concept, the reemergence of skepticism, right? Skepticism's huge, okay? And if you pair skepticism and rationalism together, you get what's known as a philosopher, right? Like, so now the philosophers, even of ancient Greece, were skeptics, right? A skeptic is a very, very important thing. I'm a huge skeptic, all right? Just to give you all a heads up in general, like, if you ever ask some Soteria a question about what he thinks about a thing, if it's actually, like, real or not, blah, 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 I'm going to usually 9 times out of 10 give you the skeptical answer. I'm going to really consider it and question it a lot. I'm going to question the established authority almost 9 times out of 10. I love doing that stuff. I love being like, whoever decided to do 2 periods before lunch and 2 after, that's terrible. That's skepticism right there, right? It's the belief that nothing is beyond the shadow of a doubt and that nothing is above questioning, right? And that nothing is actually like the perfect version of itself. We can always strive for more, right? The ancient and medieval skeptics are going to like kind of like do this entire thing. Aristotle, you would consider, is an ancient skeptic, right? Socrates is an ancient skeptic because he actually told the Greeks, hey, man, democracy might not be the best idea because we're letting dumb people vote for stuff, right? And then you've also got to like turn away from the myths, right? The myths probably aren't real. There's probably not gods that are very vengeful sitting on top of a mountain trying to hurt us. That's your ancient and medieval skeptics, right? And then you have literally some later skeptics during the Middle Ages, but they're not going to be that like avid, not that very, very large. But Cicero was a skeptic of ancient Rome. Plato, Aristotle, Diogenes are your ancient and medieval skeptics. St. Augustine is going to be one of your medieval skeptics. And then, of course, going forward, though, your Enlightenment skeptics are going to be very, very big. But that's when we're going to talk about Voltaire. We're going to talk about Baron de Montesquieu, right? Diderot. Diderot's a big one, even though you're going to write like 4 words about Diderot. He's still a massive skeptic because he believes that all information is actually belongs to the public and that everyone should have access to free and intelligent information, right? Oh, we wouldn't have Wikipedia without Denis Diderot, right? But we'll talk about him, or it's Denis Diderot. Like, so now going into it, though, also, they have this big idea, though, in the Enlightenment, right? Apply science to society. And that's where you get your philosophical thought during the entire Enlightenment period. Looking at what we have, right? Kind of like a control group in an experiment, right? Looking at the society we have. What are its biggest weaknesses? What can we do with our society to improve those weaknesses, right? How can we make sure that people have jobs? How can we make sure that people have incomes? How can we make sure that people avoid harsh taxation? How can we make sure the lives of citizens of a nation are just a little bit better, right? Now, the thing about it, though, when we looked at this, we already started talking about the Enlightenment just a touch, right? When we actually talked about how it basically is going to grow itself out of the aftermath and the ashes of the English Civil War. Because our first two people that we'll talk about during the Enlightenment are actually English thinkers that are going to come along during the Commonwealth period, and then also, of course, after the Commonwealth fails, and then there's the Restoration Monarchy. Now, the roots of the Enlightenment begin with Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, right? Because they're trying to understand the best way for humans to be ruled, right? And this is a thing where you can't sit down and design an experiment about it, but of course they're going to have two debating ideas, right? Thomas Hobbes, when he looked at the entire thing, he was skeptical about the ideas of people, right? He was skeptical about, do people actually look out for one another? Are people vengeful creatures? Are they more animalistic in nature? And that's a big thing he deduced, right? Thomas Hobbes, when he wrote the Leviathan, thought that people were just a mass, right? A mass of disgusting that would destroy one another if given the opportunity. And then, of course, in this Leviathan text, he's going to also talk about how you need to give your rights over to an absolutist so he can protect you from one another, right? And so that's why an absolutist or a monarch is supposed to be the all-powerful one that should never be checked by laws or by a parliament or by a legislative branch or anything like that, which this is a bold move, Hobbes, because you had me at people are scum, but now you're losing me at, like, I have to give my rights over to an absolutist, right? Now, that right there, though, is also another important premise, that social contract theory, right? Hobbes is going to create, write that down somewhere, just so you get comfortable with that word. He's going to really create that concept of the social contract theory, right? The social contract theory is going to state basically the idea of what is the give and take, right? What is the give and take between a society and its people, right? So if I were to actually look over here really quick at this whiteboard, okay? The social contract idea is basically if we want the best society, okay? And then we have two groups of people. We have the government, all right? So the government, and then we have what's known as the governed, right? The governed are the people that are actually being governed over, okay? So when we look at these two people, basically in the essence of the social contract is basically Thomas Hobbes is arguing the fact, social contract. Like Thomas Hobbes is arguing the idea that things need to be give and take, right? Now, for example, though, when social contract theories actually look through a Hobbesian view of things in the Leviathan, he believes that the government needs to retain most of the power to keep the governed safe, right? So the governed give their rights to this absolutist, and the absolutist in turn protects them from one another, right? That is your contract, right? This is what I'm giving up so I get something in return. Now, Locke, on the other hand, heavily disagrees with this, right? Locke is actually going to change this social contract theory, and he's going to use it very, very well. And do not get this confused with the fact that a later Enlightenment thinker that we'll talk about when we actually get closer to the French Revolution, a guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that I love to call J.J. Rosé because I think it's like a SoundCloud name, you know what I mean? So now he actually has a book called The Social Contract that within the very first page he said, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains," right? So by getting into it, though, this is your Hobbesian view of the idea, right? This is your Hobbes view of the idea. The Locke view of the idea is actually the other way around. The power should rest within the governed, right? That the people of a nation are the ones that have natural rights, right? You got your life, you got your liberty, you got your property, right? And those things are super, super important, and they can never be tampered with. And so basically the idea is that the government exists to protect these things, and that if you do not protect them, that the people then have the right to show up over here and revolt and freak out and actually change their government to make sure their natural inalienable rights are protected. So as you can see, the social contract theory is super, super important. And if you don't get the social contract theory, come and see me. We'll chat about it a little bit. We'll talk about how it's a giant metaphor for how we should actually be ruled over by our governments and stuff, right? It's very, very important, though. So really, really quickly, though, social Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is going to write all his ideas down in the Leviathan, right? Talk about basically how an absolutist is the best way to go. Now, John Locke, on the other hand, is going to write most of his ideas down in this thing called the Two Treatises on Government, right? Where he's going to talk about those natural inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, right? And liberty is a big term. Liberty is a big umbrella that includes the rights and certain freedoms, like freedoms of religion, freedoms of speech, things like that. Now, another big thing that he's also going to do, though, is begin to actually argue a lot of different perspectives. Remember the Leviathan perspective, though. Humans are awful. Give up your power to a strong leader. That's your social contract, right? Now, the Two Treatises on Government, though, is going to talk about humans have natural rights, life, liberty, and property, right? Government should protect them. And he also believed in this other thing, though. On human understanding was another really, really big thing that he's going to introduce into the Enlightenment, okay? So these two guys that are kind of our starting line of the Enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes does not only actually argue for a certain society of how we should be governed, but another big thing that he begins to argue about is how do we learn anything, right? Like, how do we learn anything? How do we know anything, right? How do we know anything beyond the shadow of a doubt? What is human intelligence, right? And he actually formulated this theory that we are all born a blank slate, or as you would say in Latin, tabula rasa, right? Like, so he would actually say basically we learn everything from experience, right? Which actually goes against some of Descartes' ideas, because Descartes believed actually that like the human mind and dualism, that these two things are separated, right? He believed a little bit, Descartes actually believed a little bit that you do get some things intuition, right? You get some things provided to you, that the human mind is something that actually exists and it's something that can formulate its own thoughts and ideas, whereas John Locke argues actually the only reason you know anything is just because you've experienced something in your life, and that this thing right here is no longer blank, right? That every time you have an experience, a mark is made on this board. Tabula rasa means blank slate, as in a blank chalkboard, right? So basically like, oh, I learned how to not get into a car accident because I got in one when I was like 16, right? Like I actually did, and so I was like, okay, I need to not like ride up on people because somebody stopped at a red light and like I of course hit them. So literally, boom, tabula rasa. It was written on my slate not to do that anymore, right? And so that's John Locke's ideas on human understanding. So a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers, and you could argue Rene Descartes is both an Enlightenment thinker and a scientific revolutionary thinker, but we don't want to get into the weeds just yet because we can get really confusing really, really fast. But the thing about it, though, is that the human understanding is going to be a very large theme of the Enlightenment, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, those two guys are English, okay? Those two guys are English, and they're going to be heavily around in the 1600s, right? Coming in, of course, with the English Civil War, the Commonwealth period, the fall of the Commonwealth period, and the Restoration period. Now, going into it that we also need to understand, though, is you're seeing the growth of this thing known as the philosophe, right? Because the idea of the Enlightenment is actually going to spread pretty quickly, but it's not going to stay in England. It's actually going to spread, and it's going to flower and fully fruit in a different country, okay? Something that we need to understand really, really quickly is that the Enlightenment may have its roots in England, but it bloomed in a different place, right? This is like a lot like that humanism and the candle in the dark room allegory that I made. I'm really good at metaphors lately. Now, the thing that you need to understand, though, is the philosophe idea is like a construct that actually grew in one specific country, and none other than, what country do you think it was? Of France. Yeah, France is going to be the place where it actually really blows up. A philosophe is an intellectual that believed that they were lighting the world with the gifts of intelligence, right? Like that humanistic perspective. Like they were paving the way for human intelligence and making everything in the world a little bit of a better place. It starts, though, in France, right? France is where the actual Enlightenment blows up. And then also it's where the French Revolution blows up, right? So we can see how those two things kind of coincide together. The French Revolution is a direct product of the Enlightenment. And so is the American Revolution, actually, because, of course, that Locke idea of that social contract of being like, yo, protect me or else I'm going to revolt is exactly why, of course, the American colonists felt threatened by the British, because they were like, you are not protecting me, you are taking from me, right? You are taking my property, you are taking my life, you are taking my liberty, so I'm going to revolt against you. And then the French are going to do the exact same thing, right? Inspired, of course, by the Americans. Now, the French philosophe construct idea, though, grew a lot in France, but why France, right? Like, why France out of all the places, right? Like, I know Russia or the Netherlands, right? The Netherlands was blowing up at the time, right? Like, got the East India Company. They're draining, like, the ocean to make new fields, right? They're taking land back, right? So, like, now, like, when you're looking at all this different stuff, it's very important to understand something, though. Why France, right? Well, France is actually seeing a massive growth in a lot of different things. Well, first and foremost, France has a very high population, right? It's got the biggest population in all of Europe. It's got over 25 million people by this point. And then also, France is the international language of the elite, and it's also very, very important that we understand that. Remember, not the 5th of November. We'll also remember the 5th of November, right? Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason plot. So the thing about it that we also need to understand, though, as well, is that do not forget what language Peter the Great made people speak to him when he was talking about government, politics, and society, right? He said, you best speak to me in French because that is the language of the elite, right? That is the language of the economist, of the enlightened thinker. It's the language of the people that know what's going on, right? So that was really, really big, okay? And since it was the most populous country, and then also, of course, since like most like articles and these books are going to originally be, their original versions were all in French, that's going to be a big thing as well. Also, French citizens had massive access to written materials by this point, okay? Both legal and illegal, okay? So we'll talk about this a lot when we get really, really close to the French Revolution. There was a massive amount of illegal literature that actually ran around all over the place because a print shop might make things like propaganda illegally that would slander kings and stuff like that. But it was illegal and the press was heavily actually censored. And if you got caught like saying negative things about kings and queens or nobles and lords and stuff like that, you could easily be locked up. That was illegal forms of literature, right? Like there were pamphlets, y'all, that I kid you not, when we get closer to the French Revolution, that were so mean to Marie Antoinette. Like, so mean, like called her so many terrible things, and she really didn't even do much of anything. Also made fun of Louis XVI, their king, and stuff like that, and they were very easy to access, and nobody knew where they were coming from, because like literally like some guy on the street might sell them to you, but literally he was just given them by somebody else, right? But there was also a massive amount of legal literature and huge amounts of print shops that actually were created and that actually printed lots and lots of books, and they're having more and more access. Something that you need to understand about the 1700s and the 1600s is that your access to written material is better than it ever has been, right? There's chapbooks, novels, poems, pamphlets, like stuff like that running around all over the place by this point. And then also something you need to understand is that French philosophers sought to spread their word to the educated nobles, not the poor. Now, this is really, really important, okay? The thing about a French philosopher is that they actually had a society that backed them, right? All these nobles, even though they were a part of the problem that these like Enlightenment thinkers were railing against, they were the ones that wanted to hear about it. Like they were the ones that wanted to hear about it. They had parties dedicated to them. Like they would literally have like Enlightenment thinkers invited over to their house. They would have parties where everybody would get like kind of drunk and like listen to these people argue. Like they'd be like, the nobility is holding us back, and then literal nobles are in the room being like, oh, they're so right. Like so, like now the thing about it though is that the nobles and of course where they're located is going to be a nexus of Enlightenment thought, and then it slowly leaks out into the rest of society. Now going into it though, we got to talk about a few of these French philosophers, right? One of the most important ones. We're going to try and get through at least two of them, or actually we're probably going to get through all three. We'll get through all three of them real quick. The French philosophers that you need to know real fast. One of the most important ones is a man by the name of Baron de Montesquieu, right? Like so there, I used to have a kid that I used to teach back in the day at this other school called Camden Catholic that I'm actually wearing the sweater right now. His name is Shane Slack. And Shane, if you're hearing this right now, I highly doubt you are, but if you're hearing this, it's a huge impact on me because this kid used to call him Montesquieu, and I thought it was the funniest thing that I've ever heard. Like so, like, and he would just like always add like an E on the end of it, and so like the next time he said it'd be like Montesquieu, and then like the third time he said it'd be Montesquieu, and like so like, and it was absolutely hilarious, right? But Baron de Montesquieu is going to be extremely important because he is rich, he is smart, and he's already becoming famous. So he was born to a very, very wealthy family, and he started his writing career very, very early. And he also was heavily educated. Now, the big thing that we need to understand, though, is he got a little bit of fame early on because he actually wrote a funny little satire of French society making fun of other French people. You gotta love satire, right? So like now the thing that we need to understand, when you think satire, you should think like South Park, right? Have you ever seen like the show South Park that makes fun of society all the time? They literally like play both sides, right? And they're like, you shut up, all this is dumb, right? So the thing about it though is the Persian Letters is a satire of French society. He actually wrote a story basically from the perspective of two Persian guys walking around France and then basically pointing at things and like kind of making fun of them and just observing them. And why would they use their perspective? Because they're Easterners, right? These Persians are like from what is now modern day Iraq, right? Like so like that literally, so they were all the way over from the Middle East, right? And they're observing Western society, right? Just like Peter the Great observed it, right? They were observing, they're being like, oh, this feels silly. Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? That's ridiculous. But then they also made fun of themselves a little bit. They were like, well, they only have one wife here, whereas we have harems of women back in blah, 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 blah. So like, as you can tell though, this is funny because he's poking fun at his own people, right? Because he's got these Persian guys like pointing at people and making fun of everybody. And he also wrote it under a fake name. He actually wrote it under a pen name called Uzbek, right? Like because he didn't want to get in trouble and he didn't want to offend anybody, right? Because the thing about it is, you always remember, literature was heavily regulated. You couldn't just write anything or else you might end up dead, right? Now, his most famous books though, the one that you need to really, really know, is a book known as The Spirit of Laws, right? The Spirit of Laws that he published in 1748 was published anonymously. Again, because you weren't allowed to just post or print anything, right? Freedom of the press was not a thing yet, right? But the Enlightenment will inspire it because the guys like this, when they come up with great ideas, weren't even allowed to publish it because they might get in trouble. It might get executed, right? So the thing about it, though, is The Spirit of Laws was a very, very aggressive text, right? It advocated for something very, very important. against absolutism, which he was living under an absolute government by this point. By this point in time, he would have been living under the reign of Louis the 15th, right? Louis the 15th, the grandson of Louis the 14th. He would have been living underneath that one. And Louis the 15th was intense. So my guy was like a really, really big libertine and stuff like that. And he like was really kind of like out there a little bit, really intense society, really weird parties and stuff like that. And the other thing about it as well is he used a lot of money up, right? And he always was at war with England, and there was a big rivalry by this point between France and England. But he was like, look, we're allowing the personal hang-ups of this guy to like affect our taxes, to affect our lives, to affect all of our stuff. And so he said, what we need is not an absolute government. We need a government that has separated powers, right? We need a legislative branch that does this. We need an executive branch that does that. We need a judicial branch that can actually keep the other two in check. And so the thing about it is that this idea is going to bring rise to the idea of checks and balances in a multi-branch government system. And it's going to inspire directly the actual American Revolution and the American government, right? We use the ideas outlined in the Spirit of Laws about like a few decades after it was published to set up the American government, right? Hence why we have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. You have to separate the powers and give each of them a little power over each other so we can make sure that everything stays balanced out, right? So that Spirit of Laws, when it comes out, though, was almost immediately added to the index of banned books along with De Rev, and it was criticized heavily in France. By banned books, I mean, y'all, the Catholic Church banned the Spirit of Laws because it didn't like how it was talking about having a separated power, checked and balanced government, right? And in France, it was criticized super harshly by a large number of, like, some rogue nobles who were very close to the king and stuff like that. But the thing about it, y'all, is a lot of nobles started reading it, and they were like, man, this guy's onto something. The Parlement should be more powerful, right? They should have power over the king because we're the ones getting stomped on and stuff right now. The thing about it, though, also, is the Brits loved it. So, yeah, like the British people love this book. They were just like, oh my God, he's talking about us, tea and crumpets. So, like, because he actually modeled the separation of powers off the English, right? Because they had their parliament and they had their kings, right? Now, the thing about it is, if I get carried away, I'm going to talk for 35 minutes. So I'm going to cut it right there, okay? And we'll talk about my favorite Enlightenment thinker in our next class, none other than Francois-Marie Arouet, also known as Voltaire. So, yeah, and we'll talk about Voltaire in our next class, all right? I'll see y'all soon.